Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Clive Barker's Jericho for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This review is coming to you courtesy of Lord Chaos. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is a first-person shooter developed by Mercury Steam and published by Codemasters in October of 2007. And it is the second FPS that Clive Barker has been a part of. The first one being, of course, Clive Barker's Undying, which I have not actually played myself, so I can't really comment too much on that. I just know that it was fairly well received when it came out, and has been listed as one of those very influential games as far as horror-themed FPSs go. So, this is a bit of a rarity as far as video games go. You don't really see all that many horror-themed FPSs. You see plenty of zombie FPSs, but not all that many horror-themed ones that just aren't about zombies. So, the question there becomes, how did they pull it off, and did Clive Barker's writing, which we all know him for stuff like Hellraiser, did that really give the game any strength? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's rather odd, and not in the good sort of way that horror games should be. By good odd, I mean stuff like unsettling visuals. This game is gory, very gory, but it's not scary or unsettling, which is the weird part. You would kind of expect a game with the ridiculous amounts of blood and guts that this game does have to be rather unsettling, but it isn't at all. In fact, it's just kind of absurd. And the art style really doesn't help. I mean, the modeling is pretty decent. The animations, for the most part, are pretty decent as well. There are a few here and there that are outright terrible, but not all that many of them. And the ones that are terrible are usually on the enemies rather than your guys. But the main problem with the visuals is not the quality, which is just about average for the time. Instead, the problem is that the game has basically two colors, which is gray and red. And you get one guess as to what the red is. Yeah, blood and guts. That's about it. But the rest of the game is pretty much just various shades of gray. And that's it. That's not unsettling at all. It's just boring. And when you're going through all these environments and the only colors you're encountering are pretty much just red and gray, it gets very tedious very quickly. Add to that, the texture quality isn't very good, and, well, that doesn't really help the visuals out any. Meanwhile, the sound design is off doing kind of odd things as well. I mean, the sound effects themselves aren't too bad for the most part. Guns sound fairly beefy. The voice acting is a mess, to say the least. Basically, every character is about as stereotypical on the accents as they can possibly get. Like, the priest really sounds more like a preacher. You know, the whole "Praise the Lord" kind of voice going on. You've got the rather gruff sniper lady who sounds like a gruff sniper lady. It's just very stereotypical. And it's really not all that great, particularly when they're spouting the same few lines over and over and over again. It makes you wonder, well, what else do they got? And whenever situations arise where you would expect them to have some sort of emotion, they kinda don't have any. It ends up being weird. And then there's the music, which is generic horror music. Yay. But in the long run, the presentation isn't really what matters most, although it does really help to make the atmosphere good if the presentation is actually good, and in this case, it really doesn't help the atmosphere. No, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. Now, the story takes place in the near future, but the basic premise is that there's this creature called the Firstborn, which was sealed in the abyss by God before God created mankind, because the Firstborn is just so undescribably evil. It's just pure evil. And periodically it tries to break into the mortal world, and every time it breaks into the mortal world, it takes a piece of the world with it, but it also gets sealed back away by various sorcerers, basically, who go into the what is known as the box and seal it away. the box, of course, expanding more and more as the Firstborn keeps pushing its way out. And the fate of the people who go into the box is unknown. They never emerge. So it's just kind of a crapshoot as to what you have to do once you get in there to seal this thing away. And Jericho's squad, who you play as, are sent in to investigate the situation and then, of course, seal away this ancient evil when they find out what it is. And so you play as Ross, who is pretty much the most normal of the squad. He's just kind of there. And he's voiced by Steve Bloom, which is always fun. But he actually ends up dying very, very early on in the game. This is not much of a spoiler because it feeds into the actual gameplay mechanics, which you kind of need to have happen really early on in order for it to actually work out the way it does. He basically ends up turning into a spirit, which will then possess his squad mates. And this is how you jump between your various squad mates, each of whom have their own specific weapons and abilities. And they range from, of course, Delgado, who I ended up playing as most of the time because he's basically a walking tank, and then all the way to Billy, who is basically a ninja. And each of these characters pretty much follows an archetype. It's nothing particularly amazing as far as the characterization goes. They're just kind of there, and they fit their stereotype, and that's about it. They don't really delve into the backstories all that much. It just doesn't really do much that it could to get you invested in these characters and such. So you don't really care what happens to them when you actually go into the game, particularly because of what happens during the gameplay. Now, the plot itself does end on a cliffhanger. I do have to make note of that. And said cliffhanger is just kind of pathetic. In fact, most of the story in this game is fairly pathetic, which seems kind of odd. I wouldn't really expect that, but the plot actually ended up not really working out all that well in the game's favor. It's fairly coherent for the most part, but it just doesn't really get very engrossing. And what you're doing in the game really doesn't drive home the point that, hey, this is basically you trying to save the world from being devoured by evil. You kinda get that, but for the most part it downplays it in favor of the gameplay, which is the main problem. Because the gameplay in this thing is rather wimpy. It's a first-person shooter. It has 6 different characters that you can play as, basically. Again, each of whom have their own abilities. And you do have some very, very basic squad commands. You can tell them to follow you, or you can tell them to hold position. That's it. And when you're actually running around and blasting the monsters and such like that, it's really not all that satisfying. Enemies are bullet sponges. And so, when you're sitting there wailing on these enemies with what you think is actually very powerful weaponry, because, for instance, it sounds pretty badass and everything, it takes a lot to bring them down. And it's not even that they're smart enemies or anything like that. They're dumb. They waltz towards you. They start whacking you upside the head with their melee, or they hit you from afar with their mortar shells or whatever the hell they're using, or blast you with their miniguns. They don't really use cover all that much. Some of them do, but most of them just kind of shamble towards you. And when they finally get up towards you, they wreak havoc upon your squad. And you just waste tons and tons of ammunition trying to bring them down. Which would be a problem if you didn't get your ammo resupplied every few minutes. Whenever you hit a checkpoint, your ammo and everything are instantly replenished. There are no ammo or health pickups of any kind. There is regenerating health in this thing, and it takes forever to regenerate. I don't know why, but it does. Every character's abilities don't have any particular energy requirement or anything like that. They just have a cooldown period, and most of them are fairly short cooldown periods. So you're never going to be really wanting for ammo unless you're playing it on hard, where the enemies are even more bullet spongy than they are on normal, which is pretty ridiculous. None of this is helped by your squad AI being incredibly stupid. As you will see in the clip I'm showing you, they just stand there and let themselves be shot to bits. All the time. No matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, they will allow themselves to get shot to bits all the time. And it's incredibly irritating. And so, what in theory actually isn't very difficult if your squad mates were fairly competent, is made ridiculously long and drawn out. Not difficult, but long and drawn out, because you'll just end up having to run around and heal all your squad mates over and over and over again as they rush into battle and get themselves killed without actually doing anything important. Because pretty much all they do is open fire. Occasionally they will actually use their powers, but certain ones won't use them at all, like Cole, for instance. The only thing Cole does is resupply ammo. You have to take control of Cole in order to use her temporal loop power, which is basically you slow time down to a crawl. And then you can, of course, run around and do all sorts of hilarious circle strafing and blasting enemies. But the problem being her weapon is so pathetically wimpy that you barely do anything to the enemies. In fact, most of the weapons in this game are outright pathetic. There's only a handful that actually seem to do any damage, so it's just a long, drawn-out, boring FPS in the worst way. Even worse, they pulled out all the stops with elements that should not be in this game. For instance, quick time events. The whole press X to not die thing, yeah, that's in here. Only it's done in specific sequences, I might add, where you have to press directional keys in order to survive the instance. And you barely get any time to actually pull these off, so you'll find that you'll be failing those a lot, particularly early on, when you're not expecting it, and all of a sudden, quick time event. So, ultimately, Jericho ends up being just a very mediocre FPS that's made even worse by its really poor AI and bad design choices. It is extremely linear. There's no branching paths or anything like that to worry about. There's barely any characterization going on. There's a very pathetic plot. The gameplay itself becomes a chore. And ultimately, it just ends up being a rather pathetic game. Even more than just being mediocre. That's why I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.